Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to this very complex panel on complexities, right the way after lunch, just to keep everyone awake. So the title of the session is Responsible Recruitment, Understanding and Managing Regional Complexities. And we all know that global supply chains span geographic boundaries, and as part of their due diligence, it's really important to understand where risk may lie for business operations. And to be effective, that risk assessment must include both a sort of wider geo-political analysis and clear understanding of what the impacts of that are for on the ground for workforces, including migrant workers. In this session, we're going to have a closer look at three particular locations or recruitment corridors. And so we hope that this is interesting from a location point of view, that you'll find out more about Myanmar, Taiwan and the Gulf, but also help to sort of demonstrate and show where a deeper understanding of the operating context is a vital part of company due diligence. So I've got three great panelists here. Thein is a senior consultant at the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, one of IHRB's sister or partner organisations. And she's obviously going to be talking about Myanmar migrant workers around the world. We have our question moderator, Bonny Ling, who's also, when she's not working with us, is the Executive Director of Work Better Innovations. And Bonny is Taiwanese and is going to be talking to us about the situation of Taiwan. And then we have at the end Tamara Juburi, who is Gulf Sustain Manager for IHRB, so IHRB's expert of everything to do with the Gulf. So, Thein, I'm going to start with you first of all. As we all know, the tentative steps that Myanmar have been making towards a more democratic form of government, and that had been accompanied by sort of significant investment in the country by companies, but this was all halted by the military coup that took place in 2021. And the impact of that on the Myanmar economy has been dramatic, with many high-profile companies halting operations in the country. And that's what a lot of business and human rights focus has been on. Should I stay or should I go? You know, that's been the conversation. But the inevitable consequence of the situation in Myanmar is that many workers have been forced to leave the country to find employment in a wide range of other countries, but particularly in neighbouring Thailand. Now, I know that you're going to give us an overview of what you see happening in the region.
Thank you, Neill. Can you hear me?
Yep. And I think the slides are going to come up.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Thein, and thank you, Neill, also. So, Myanmar is actually a country, as you know, in Southeast Asia. We're actually one of the main countries of origin of migration. And most of the Myanmar migrant workers, when they go abroad, the destination countries are Thailand, which is a neighboring country of Myanmar. We have about 70% of Myanmar labor migrants who go to Thailand, whether it's legally or undocumented. And then other main destinations of migration for Myanmar migrant workers are to Malaysia, and then also to Singapore, China, as well as to Korea, Japan, and also to the Middle Eastern countries such as the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and we're also seeing workers going to Oman and more recently. So the drivers of migration. Of course, the livelihood and economic factors, they remain as the main reason for migration. Of course, this is also combined with a poor economic outlook, looking at now with more factory closures, disruptions to trade, power shortages, and also there's an inflation which raises the prices of commodities for families in the country. And we have, of course, the insecurity and the ongoing conflict in the country, and more recently, since February, also the fear of conscription. So when we're looking at the legal migration routes, we have the MOU system, but also mainly to Thailand, particularly in Thailand, because we also share our borders with. We have what is called the Cabinet Resolution for National Verification process, and this is known as the pink card route, which means that this is how migrant workers regularize themselves having come across from Myanmar to Thailand. There's also other forms of MOU, such as the border employment for seasonal work, and also more recently we are seeing workers migrating to China to work. And we're also seeing this more in the manufacturing sector. For example, we have Myanmar workers in the garment factories in Myanmar who are now migrating to Thailand to work in garment factories over there, which means that they can continue to use their skill sets and they also paid a better job, better pay. Just to say that Myanmar has also participated in the 7th Abu Dhabi Dialogue Ministerial Consultation in February, where the State Administration Council's Ministry of Foreign Affairs had announced that efforts are underway to send Myanmar migrant workers to the Middle East as well. And here, another point to make is that where there are legal migrants, there are more numbers of illegal Myanmar undocumented workers abroad as well. Just to touch base on the issues, situations related to the passport, taxation, and remittance. So the passport process, applying the passport process in Myanmar, or even reapplying for a passport process in Myanmar can be a lengthy one. Sometimes it can take up to 6 months before you get an appointment. And of course, it is a complex process and tends to be involved with also with corruption. Of course, and since September last year, we're also seeing that passport renewal of labor migrants who are abroad who want to renew their passports. Now they have to also provide evidence of a 2% income tax that they have already paid the income tax. There are also new instructions and regulations coming underway. For example, last month, there was an instruction to the recruitment agencies where workers between the age of 23 to 31 should not be signed for the worker contract when they want to go abroad. But then that instruction has backtracked. And then earlier this month, there was also an instruction where because when workers leave the country, we have 9 different types of passports. And when the workers leave the country, they have what is called the PJ passport or the job passport. So because sometimes it is more difficult for workers who want to start leaving the country to acquire a job passport with other necessary documents. What is happening is that people are actually living with a visit passport and then trying to work in the destination country and getting a work permit over there. So what's happening in the earlier of this month is that there has also been prohibition of job passports being conversion to visit passports as well. And then looking at the rules on income tax, well, there has been a recent introduction of old provisions that actually allows Myanmar to tax overseas workers, and that is for the workers a flat rate of 2%. So, but if the workers in a foreign country, if they are also paying domestic tax to the host country, then that can also be offset. Looking at more on remittances, there's also the question of the requirement of whether workers abroad have to pay, or have to send 25% of their income to their families in Myanmar, and whether through the obligation, through the banking systems to send to Myanmar. So this is to their families. But then still up to date, how this will be implemented and how it will be enforced is still unclear. So there's still a lot of instructions, but also unclear enforcements in place as well. Challenges are many. Of course, when we look at the drivers to leave the country to work abroad, the vulnerabilities at home, the drivers become also the vulnerabilities, also the drivers of migration. But here I also wanted to highlight, if you can look at the bottom left side, you'll see some numbers with Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and etc. So in fact, that's the approved fee, which the Myanmar agencies can charge in the country. So this is for, so depending on the country and depending on the level of skilled labor job that you are requiring, there's a difference in terms of the charge. But this is only for the recruitment charges. In reality, for charge of the financial cost of migration is much bigger, much higher. And in cases of going to Thailand, for example, it could be 10 times more than this. But just to put this into perspective, a worker in Myanmar in the factory, their average wage is about 1.4 US dollars. So for someone who only earns about 1.4 US dollars, if they want to leave the country to migrate to a job to another country, that financial cost is actually a big burden, which means that first of all, they probably have to use the little money they've already saved up. If they have some land back in their hometown, or their family would probably have to sell their land. And even if that's still not enough, then they probably have to lend money with high interest rates. That being said, we also have a lot of channels nowadays for fraud and schemes. And just to give an example is that imagine you have workers who, let's say, already saved that little money, also sold the land, taking up high interest rates to prepare to go abroad, with this hope that when they do get abroad, then they will get a job that actually can make enough money to repay all of that and make enough money to send back home. But then a few months later, you're mentally preparing yourself, and then you're told that you're nearly getting your passport and things are underway, but then abruptly, you learn that you've been scammed. So now you don't have the money saved, the land is gone, and you're left with the high interest rates. In other words, you're actually in a worse off position than where you started. And this is actually the situation that many of those aspiring to leave the country are actually facing right now. There are different channels of scamming and fraud channels online as well as on the ground. And of course, when these scammers disappear, it's really difficult to track them down, and more difficult to get your money back or even take them to court. And of course, when we speak with the civil society organizations who work on the ground in the communities to promote safe migration, but also trying to prevent scams happening in the community, they're actually threatened by these informal brokers and scammers. Of course, these are the kind of situations and challenges that some of the workers, aspiring workers who are trying to migrate abroad are facing. But in addition, when they do go abroad, there are also, I think many of the other panelists have also mentioned earlier on, there are also challenges when they go abroad, such as even if you're going with an MOU, you might still be stranded without work over there. And there are also other issues related to unscrupulous brokers in the country of the host country, and working conditions which can be exploitative, discriminatory, and also having experiencing harassments. And of course, even in other countries, there's still high commodity costs, which can actually impact on the workers, especially while they're still trying to look for work in the other country. For illegal migrants, the situation is more dire. It's actually more challenging. In addition to the challenge of migration, there's also unequal working conditions, limited access to health, especially for mental health. And of course, for those migrating illegally, there's always this constant threat of deportation.
Thank you, Thein. And I mean, that was really comprehensive. And so just to sort of clarify a few points, workers from Myanmar are extremely motivated to leave the country. Yes. There's an economic imperative. However, there's also, because of conscription, a physical imperative as well, that people are migrating because they don't want to have to join the Myanmar army and fight. I think that the other thing that's interesting, and it's important not to lose this, is the idea that Myanmar workers might pay tax outside of Myanmar, and this has implications for companies who are employing those workers, because that tax will be paid to the current regime in Myanmar, and so there's a danger that companies could be deemed being in some way complicit with what is going on if they fulfill that requirement. We should also remember that, of course, and this is true for many migrant workers, that families and loved ones are very often left at home. And so whatever you might do abroad, it might impact on family. And these are other compelling reasons that workers may act in a certain way. And all of these things may mean that workers end up working illegally or undocumented, as we say, in other countries all the way around the world. And Myanmar workers, we're seeing Myanmar workers turn up in all sectors and all locations. Very often these were quite trained, highly trained workers, a lot of hospitality sector workers and others who are now having to try and find work all the way around the world. But it seems, Titi, that these migrant workers, they're really caught between a rock and a hard place, right, because there's requirements from their own government that impose a range of challenges. But if they fulfill those, or they don't fulfill those, they end up operating in an undocumented way. And what's particularly disheartening, and the one thing that maybe we haven't mentioned, is around walk-in recruitments, that very often others are taking advantage of that situation and using it to exploit these workers even more, with hiring managers, particularly in Thailand, charging migrant workers fees for walk-in recruitments and so on. And we're seeing a whole range of other exploitations that, just when people are really down and out, other people, rather than helping, are just serving to visit further exploitation on them because they're vulnerable. Thein, thank you very much for that. That was great. I'm going to turn now to Bonny, who, as well as being our question Meister, is also leads her own organisation, Work Better Innovations, but also is a Taiwanese expert. And Bonny, companies in Taiwan featuring the supply chains have many well-known international brands. Taiwan is also part of the sort of critical production network for computer chips in particular. And earlier this year, myself and our colleague Guna joined you in Taiwan for the first Business and Human Rights Forum, which was illuminating for me. But I understand you're now going to tell us a little bit more about Taiwan and what you see are the challenges for companies choosing to source goods from there.
Thank you very much for the invitation. The challenge for me is to talk about Taiwan in only 10 minutes. But I want to start off by thanking we see an increase in the online participations of callers from Taiwan. You're not here, but I know you're here. So thank you for calling in this late. We know what we have to do for Taiwan. We're not making reforms at the speed that we want and we need for the protection of migrant rights in Taiwan. So let's keep talking past this presentation. So the case of migration to Taiwan, I want to quickly give you an overview. Many of you here would have known a bit about remediation of recruitment fees in Taiwan, so this would not be a surprise. But I want to quickly say that this is the latest figure available from the Ministry of Labor. We have about 758,000 registered migrant workers in Taiwan at the moment. It's very regulated, meaning that there are broadly only two sectors of work where companies can hire, or employers can hire migrant workers. And they're roughly called productive industries and social welfare. So we see roughly the figure here. Now, social welfare is mostly, domestic care, those involved in the care of the elderly and the disabled. So we see that that's roughly at 250,000. So when we're looking at supply chain issues in Taiwan, we're mostly focused on roughly the 500,000 migrant workers. And they're placed across the range of work, So Neill mentioned electronics and chips, definitely. Many of you probably would have heard of fisheries and construction, advanced textiles, and specialized sporting goods and so forth. There are 4 countries of origin, so 4 former migration corridors to Taiwan. So they are Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Thailand. So if we're looking at these numbers and we dig just a layer above, they're fairly differentiated by sector of work. So if we're looking at number, well, the top 2 countries are Indonesia and Vietnam. That the most migrant workers in Taiwan are from Indonesia and Vietnam. But if we correlate that with sector of their work, we see a different picture. So if we're looking at supply chain, we're mostly looking at workers from Vietnam, and we're looking at workers from the Philippines, where you see about 90% and 82% of them, respectively, are placed in industry. Now, if you're looking at domestic care, most of the workers would be hired from Indonesia, and they are, as we know, mostly women. The government recently announced there will be a 5th migration corridor that's to come, potentially next year, 2025, with India. And I will talk a little bit about this in the slide on complexities. All right, complexities. So I want to debunk the first one. And I hear this a lot in Taiwan, which is that the migration picture is too complicated. It's complicated. Well, we just heard from Titi. And I always say, comparatively, Taiwan has a straightforward migration picture. 4 migration corridors. We have about 80,000 undocumented migrant workers who have absconded. That's probably at the lower end of estimates. We have about 20,000 children who are not registered, stateless. So this is broadly the picture we're looking at. And when we're looking at neighbors of Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, their migration corridors feature in double digits, right? So I think this is a myth that we need to debunk, which is that Taiwan has a complicated migration picture, because it does not correlate with evidence. But it is an opportunity because of the fact that it is more straightforward, that we can fix more things. There are more known variables. So there are other real complexities. Some of them I'll just talk a little bit about, and some of them might be surprising. So I have here on the screen the Dhaka principles, and they are in the traditional Chinese script. So one of the complexities that come up, and it's one of these, devils in the detail type of things that can impede your discussion with suppliers. Just what language are you going to the supplier with? Is it in the script they understand? So traditional Chinese script is different from simplified Chinese script. Most of the documents that we find now in Chinese are in the simplified script, which is the script that is used in China, but it's not the script that's used in Taiwan. So there's almost like a, complexity that is, imagine going to a supplier and said, these are your code of conduct, and we took the initiative of translating into Chinese, and it's not the right script. It could be a little bit off-putting. Now, I'm curious, because I know it has happened to me where they show me a Chinese document and it's not in traditional script. We also know that the buyer-supplier relationship is not symmetrical, right? So how many suppliers actually turn around to their buyers and said, I'm sorry, but this is not the script we use, right? And I think this is important. This is a complexity that needs to be teased out, that there are local variations that can either facilitate or impede this genuine dialogue that you can have with your suppliers and workers. Now, I mentioned quickly about this corridor that's to come with India. Taiwan, very soon, next year, will be a super aged society, a distinction that it shares with Japan, meaning that 1 in 5 out of 1 in 5 people in Taiwan is over the age of 65. Now, Taiwan is reaching that distinction at a much faster rate than what Japan, how many years Japan took to reach that. So the issue of this population decline is on everyone's mind, and it's been listed as a national security issue. So this migration of potential workers from India is seen as a way to kind of, meet the demand of the domestic economy. But it faced backlash, and also the key question to ask is, we know about the problems that exist in migration corridors all over the world, not just in Taiwan. Is it a simple copy and paste, or are we going to aim to do it better? Now, there are some other local particularities that I would like to just quickly go over. So this is in the law, in the regulations of Taiwan. And those of you who have worked on remediations in Taiwan would know this. To my knowledge, Taiwan's the only place that has this, where migrants pay this. They pay this out of their monthly pay slip, and it's called the monthly service fees. It's staggered, meaning that the fees are differentiated based on their year of service in Taiwan. So it's about $50 that's taken from their wage every month. And most remediations are focused on the repayment of these fees because the other fees are prohibited in Taiwanese law. So you have to do additional layers of digging, right, to find the evidentiary trail. Okay. In comparison, what do employers pay? $2,000, and it's calculated on an annual basis. So this does not make sense. Why do we put monthly service charges on migrant workers and we only charge $2,000 annually for employers? What does this fee cover, and what are they paying for? Now, I put a picture of a migrant care worker in the parks of Taiwan. It's a very common theme because Taiwan is also a rapidly aging society. So this is not a very unique thing. You see that all over. Migrant domestic workers hasn't featured so much in our discussion so far because we're looking at supply chains. It did feature very importantly in the panel yesterday on women migrant workers. But this, for me, is the linchpin. It's the heart of the knot that we cannot yet entangle. Now, let me just quickly tell you why is this an interesting and very difficult local challenge is because when we look at moving to the employer pays principle, move to the employer pays principle, we're also asking employers of migrant domestic workers to pay this charge. Now imagine if you're doing an election that you know it's tight. Which politician would come up and say, when things are tight, that I advocate for changing to the employer pays principle when I, as an employer of a migrant domestic worker in the family, taking care of the parents, have to pick up this cost. But if we can address this, I believe we can untangle the puzzle because that's where I see in my conversations with Taiwanese suppliers, employers, civil society, government, they all come down to this question, so who pays? Are you asking for all the employers to pay? And all the employers of migrant domestic workers would say, we need someone to help us take care of the elderly. So there are various issues, right? We're also looking at the invisibility of women's work in the household. Why is that not recognized to the same degree? So I'll just quickly park it there as a local oddity that we can all think about in the Q&A. And I will just mention a few things at a crossroad for Taiwan. Thank you very much for, the opportunity here for us to talk about Taiwan. The crossroad being of many things, but I'll just put two things out there. One, Taiwan's investments in Southeast Asia surpassed that of China for the first time. I think fairly recently. Couple that with Taiwanese export to the US exceeded Taiwanese export to mainland China by 2 million, I think it's dollars, this year for the first time. So we see this active movement of investments away from mainland China to other localities in Southeast Asia and other markets, one of them being the EU. So the fact that we're talking about the CSDDD, it's keenly felt in Taiwan as an opportunity for investment, but also for the future of how Taiwan sits with the world. Thank you, Neill.
Thank you very much, Bonny. Just to add a further complexity to an already complex situation, but from a point of view of a civil society organisation like ourselves, we should remember that it's not possible for the UN organisations, the ILO and the IOM and others, who would normally be present in these situations, to operate within Taiwan because of the unique status of the China-Taiwan geopolitical relationship in the region. So any work that is undertaken there doesn't benefit from the input of any of the UN organisations, which adds yet a further sort of complexity there. Just very quickly, because I always love to see the Dakar Principles written in different languages. It's also available in both traditional and simplified Chinese and a range of 30 other languages on the Dakar Principles website. So wherever you're going, you can probably find a Dakar Principles that fits. But Bonny, we were really hopeful for a while that change might be on its way. When you and I were in Taiwan earlier this year, we spoke to somebody from the authorities there who was writing a new national action plan. We just had a successful, I think it was the 4th election, and it seemed that had gone smoothly, and yet more recently it seems that it wasn't quite as smooth as we hoped.
In short, yes, it's not what we had hoped. Perhaps it was not completely unexpected. I don't know. But I don't think we can ever give up the hope of changing the legislative framework, right? We keep on talking about state-based and voluntary-based industry-level initiatives. We can't stop using all the tools that we have at our disposal. So one avenue is a bit difficult now due to disagreements in the legislature. It's basically no party has a majority. It's difficult now. But on the other hand, we're hopeful that there are many brands in the room, many brands who supported the first business forum on human rights and environmental due diligence in Taiwan that took place in April that Neill talked about. And we have to find ways of creating momentum through other channels. We may not be able to have the direct technical assistance that you spoke about, Neill, but I think we all have to be creative, ways of translating this knowledge, and also to recognize that Taiwan faces unique challenges. There's no other place like it, but it's backed by a huge civil society presence, a lot of very committed people who are also with me on the line today. We're pushing for change through things that are perhaps not as well known, but we're hopeful and we'll keep pushing.
Thank you. We'll wish with you. Okay, I'm going to turn now to Tamara. Thank you for waiting, Tamara. So, the Gulf. According to the last World Bank survey, the 6 Gulf countries between them host over 30 million migrant workers, and the region is a key actor in shaping flows of migrant workers, particularly from South Asia. We also know that this has thrown up many challenges for business and governments concerning the way those workers are recruited and employed, and we've discussed these things many times at global forums and within the work that many of the organisations in this room have done and that IHRB have done. But we've got a new IHRB programme, Gulf Sustain, and it's going to be looking at these challenges, but locating that discussion within the framework of maybe a new reality, an ambition for the region. So you're going to tell us a bit more about the project. Thanks, Tamara.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to tell you, So Gulf Sustain is IHRB's regional initiative. For now, my presentation will be focused on Saudi, Qatar, and the UAE because that's where we have presence currently, although we plan to continue expanding into the other 3 GCC countries within the next year or 2. So, I mean, when we're talking about complexities in these regions, there's obviously a sort of temptation to focus on the challenges associated with it. But really, I'd like to focus a little bit more on the kind of opportunities. Gulf Sustain is framed very much with the hope of sort of advancing responsible business practices and promoting worker welfare in the context of what's happening in the Gulf. So to frame what's actually happening, to take a step back, each of the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries today is in the process of executing an economic diversification plan. So basically working to sort of reduce reliance on oil and gas and really kind of future-proof their countries. So part of this is really in recognition of the fact that they do have to shift towards a kind of greener future, a greener economy. There are a lot of common points between these very kind of ambitious plans. So common sort of denominators include betting on tourism, investing heavily in tech innovation, and critically, one of the main pillars is really pushing the kind of citizens, the national workforces, into private sector employment. Within these societies, citizens tend to be very focused on working in the public sector, whereas private sector is dominated. The majority of private sector workers are foreign nationals. So these are some of the kind of common sort of elements. But really, I think it's also very important to focus on the diversity. Whereas we tend to look at the GCC like it's a sort of homogeneous block, there's a lot of difference in terms of how they wish to be seen by the world, the role they want to play on the sort of global world, on the world stage, their priority areas and what they're really focusing on, and very importantly, the motivations for this socioeconomic change is very different. So for example, if you look at the UAE, there's a little bit less of a sense of urgency in executing these plans because, for better or worse, there's this perception globally that the UAE is a safe place to do business. There's less of a need for them to sort of reform, to do labor reforms, to improve their human rights track record, even though their situation is no better than, for example, Saudi Arabia. But one of the key differences for Saudi Arabia, for example, is that their change is very much motivated by the internal pressures of their society. So demographics really plays an important role. It's the biggest economy and country of the Gulf Cooperation Council group, and more than 60% of their population is under 30 years old. And there's a huge desire from this very young population to be future-proofed and to see a lot of change. So it's important when you're looking at this region to also focus on the kind of nuances, to be able to identify what unique opportunities lie in each of these countries. Another area, I don't know if you can see all that text, it might be too small, but another area where if you really deep dive into the kind of labor markets and the regulations of the GCC countries, you begin to understand that they're all kind of at different stages of implementing change or progress. So on the middle column is Qatar. And this is probably the country that is most reliant on foreign labor. I mean, the Qatari population, the nationals, only make up about 250,000 people. So more than 99% of their workforce, of the private sector workforce, is made up of foreign nationals. And that's not likely to change, at least not in the sort of short to mid-term. But we did see a big wave of labor reform in the build-up to the Qatar World Cup. And we're hoping to see some of that sort of change reflected in Saudi Arabia in the coming years as they kind of gear up for their own World Cup. the international sort of pressure and visibility into Qatar's labor system forced them to sort of accelerate these changes. Although there's obviously ongoing questions of how well these changes have been enforced and if they're actually just on paper. For example, one of the big ones was the abolition of the kafala or sponsorship system. But whether or not that still happens sort of culturally is more difficult to know. But in the case of Saudi Arabia, for example, they have less of a dependence. I mean, it's still the majority of the workforce is made up of migrant workers, but they have less of a dependence on them because they have more, I mean, obviously a bigger population and much more sort of socioeconomic diversity in their own national population. So, for example, over the last more than a decade, the Saudi government has been pushing to have more and more Saudi nationals work as taxi drivers, which has a real impact on foreign workers who traditionally have filled these roles. So their Vision 2030, their economic diversification plans, you could argue, has more of an impact on migrant workers kind of in the short to mid-term, between now and 2030, which is when their vision is supposed to have been executed. So Gulf Sustain sort of comes in to fill this gap a little bit. We've identified kind of 3 sort of pillars to our approach which serve to sort of fill this gap. The first is addressing the lack of data or transparency into a lot of the labor plans and the labor needs in the future through sort of building research and contributing to the basis of knowledge, basically. Second is looking into capacity building. So we're developing training modules and hosting and co-hosting strategic dialogues, both online and in person in the region, to really bring together different stakeholders and raise awareness and give them sort of a safe space to have these conversations across different stakeholder groups. And then the third is working very closely with the private sector to co-create solutions wherever possible. From our engagement with the private sector in the region, it's become very clear that one of their major needs is for knowledge to be contextualized. So whereas they understand there's things like the UN Guiding Principles, the Dhaka Principles, there are all these frameworks and tools available to them, but they don't know how to reconcile that with their own needs within their national and regional contexts, and how to keep up with such a fast-changing environment. I mean, in the Gulf, you can see policies change from one day to the next, and it's very difficult to sort of keep up with translating those policies into kind of meaningful action. I think I will stop there just for the sake of time.
Thank you very much, Tamara. So what you're sort of saying is that the new development and economic diversification that's underway in the GCC countries could offer an opportunity for change in some of the challenges that we have seen, but we're yet to find out which way these things go.
Yeah, it's exactly that. I mean, it's a matter of seeing which way it will fall, because obviously there's inherent risks. There is the risk that already vulnerable workers will continue to be exploited or be subject to poor working conditions within this transition. But what we argue at Gulf Sustain is that this is really an opportunity to advance both the people and planet agenda sort of simultaneously. With the way that the economic diversification plans are set out, is that they give you a blueprint for exactly what industries the governments will be betting on. And that gives us an opportunity to sort of anticipate some of the labor shortages and push for things like reskilling and upskilling of migrant workers to ensure that they're protected, at least within this transition.
Thank you. And more details about Gulf Sustain. Well, actually, if you put Gulf Sustain into a search engine, you'll end up on the dedicated portal for that, or please grab Tamara over coffee later. Carmen, do we have questions then, please? So Carmen's had a promotion. She's moved up from question technician. She is now our question master. Let's see if she's up to the job.
Believe it or not, it's a good place to work in IHRB. I recommend. Easy promotions. So we have received a couple of questions. Very interesting. I'm gonna shoot the 3 ones that I have recollected, and brace yourself for the third one, I must claim, because of how long it is. So the first one is, it could be for the 3 of you or either of you, what about AI? What could the role of AI be to help counter some of the challenges faced around responsible recruitment in your regions? That's the first one. The second one is, can you give punctual recommendations on the use of complaint management systems that address challenges faced by migrant workers in destination countries? So first one is AI, second one is about compliance management systems, and third one is, in practice, how has the Abu Dhabi dialogue and the Colombo process improved the recruitment process for migrant workers, including advancing efforts to eliminate worker-borne fees? What role does ASEAN have in improving recruitment and eliminating fees? And are Taiwanese recruitment issues included in these dialogue processes and regional groups? That was the third one.
Thank you, Carmen. I think that maybe we start with AI, which hasn't come up before. But do the panelists have any views on how AI might impact on some of the things that we've been discussing?
Yeah, I can take that.
Yep.
I would like to take that because Taiwan is at where it is now owing to its dominance in the semiconductor industry, right? We all have phones. You're holding literally a part that has passed through Taiwan, right? So it's seeing AI as the next industry where you can establish similar dominance. And that dominance is not just economic dominance. That dominance also comes in the form of why people care to talk about Taiwan, why Taiwan features in international discussions, even though it is not part of the UN system. So it has many different layers. NVIDIA, a company with the Taiwan founder, just became the world's largest company, valued company, more than Apple. So this is a trajectory that's happening globally with ripples that's very keenly felt in Taiwan. Now, let me counter that with an example of how AI potentially is a risk that we need to think about how to mitigate. So I highlighted the corridor potentially, what that's to come with India potentially for next year. Now, when it first came out, it faced significant backlash. There were reports of racism against those of South Asian origin, highly debated. And then there was some information that this is a misinformation campaign. Some parts of it was a misinformation campaign, because that is something that Taiwan's always on the guard against. It's difficult to wade through. Things that we're working through with AI, risk posed by AI to democracy, these are existential questions that Taiwan needs to face. I don't have all the solutions, I don't know, because it's advancing more rapidly than what my mind can analyze. But I hope that as we are looking at things like risks, we can also look at things where technology could lower the cost of supply chain due diligence for SMEs. Because another local thing that is quite odd is that Taiwan's economy is mostly SMEs, at a much higher percentage for South Korea, much higher percentage for Japan, close to 99%. So all the challenges we know about, that is the thing to sell to SMEs. How do we get them to care and feel like they're part of this discussion? That is the wider road.
Thank you, Bonny. And complaint management systems. I wonder, Thein, would that interest you?
Oh, actually, I don't need this anymore.
Do you want me to find it? Which one is it? I'll
You're
find
right.
it. This one?
Yeah, so actually, just realized that I have some recommendations put up that I didn't get a chance to speak earlier on, but these are actually some of the recommendations for the host countries. And just one message before I go to the complaint mechanism is that usually because of the challenges in the country of Myanmar, and also the countries that the migrant workers face outside the country, as well as the changing on the more information, the instructions that are coming out. When we speak to when we speak to companies who are actually having migrant workers in the supply chain, Myanmar migrant workers in their supply chain outside the country, there's a reluctance of hiring more Myanmar migrant workers because they seem that actually maybe there's more trouble and more work to be done, and maybe it's actually better just to hire nationalities from other countries instead of Myanmar. So for us, the message that we want to give is do continue to hire Myanmar migrant workers in your supply chain outside of the country. And of course, that's not only supporting the migrant workers, but also supporting their families who are in Myanmar as well. So just one message that I wanted to pass on. Complaint mechanisms, can you repeat the question again?
So how do complaint management systems operate? How could they help the situation? Would it even be relevant for Myanmar migrant workers, or are these systems in place?
So there are actually some complaint management systems. For example, IHRB have some good relation management systems, which actually allows to hear workers' voice through different channels. It's not what we are doing, but there are already some complaint mechanism systems that allow workers to receive workers' voices and to work from then onwards. And of course, it's also about getting the data from the different sources, but also making sure that these grievances are followed up to make sure that actually they're effective. So,
Thank you. Just for anyone who doesn't know, IHRB are an NGO very active in the Myanmar Thai corridor and elsewhere, and they promote an app called the Golden Dreams app, which has lots of information for workers. There was one other question about ASEAN. How has ASEAN been involved, or is ASEAN at all engaged or involved in the situation of Myanmar and Myanmar workers now travelling to other ASEAN member countries?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Oh.
Is that one a bit?
Yeah. So I think that's another reason for why a lot of these solutions that we talked about, CSDDD and legislations, the hard law approach, we have to think real hard about, do they copy and paste in Asia? Because the context is different. We don't have a very strong regional human rights system, right? We don't have we don't have the court, we don't have the regional treaty. And so on the ASEAN front, it took ASEAN member states so long, 2 decades almost, to get to the stage where we're now, where we have an ASEAN consensus on migrant workers, consensus, so it's not treaty law. And it excludes undocumented workers from the outset, unless there was a compromise language used, but effectively that's what it did. In my mind, it has never seriously engaged with the issue of recruitment fees and zero fees. So I think that is something that we need to really work on, like the normative context on which we're standing on in terms of Asia is very different. And for those of us who are working on this bridge, we're constantly doing the translation, not only in language, jumping from script, but also in normative assumptions, but also explaining that this is not imposition, because it also matters to us how we want to leave behind the world for our kids, So I think we need to use all the tools that we have, recognizing that one solution found regionally may not be the best to export it. There's some local adaptation that is involved, and it needs to come from a place of perhaps honesty and humility that we don't have all the solutions yet. You can talk about ASEAN. No?
Okay, that's fine, thank you.
That's fine.
No, that's fine. And then Tamara, we had a question, about the Abu Dhabi dialogue. Again, and I had to very quickly look it up myself, just to make sure that I got it right. But so Abu Dhabi dialogue is the countries of destination in the Gulf region working with countries of origin, mostly from sort of South Asia. But it would be stretching the truth a little bit to say that the Abu Dhabi dialogue has been a fantastic success, but where do you see it sitting now within the new paradigm that you're sort of envisaging for the Gulf region? Has it run its course, or can it be sort of reinvigorated, do you think?
I mean, my hope is that we will see it move from being a place where you sort of pay lip service to these things to being a place where actual solutions can kind of come about. But I think similarly to what Bonny was saying, to me, one of the kind of key hindrances of progress in things like the Abu Dhabi dialogue is a lack of coherence and collaboration regionally. So like you're saying about ASEAN, like with the Gulf Cooperation Council itself as a forum, it's painstakingly slow, and discussions tend to kind of fall apart in part because of different priorities, rivalries, a lot of intra-regional competition. And I think fixing that first will be a precondition of actual practical solutions coming out of things like the Abu Dhabi dialogue, which has huge potential. Obviously, it's a much needed kind of forum, but whether or not it's being used properly or to the best of its kind of ability is to be seen.
Okay, well, I think that actually leads us on to something that maybe we can consider just at the end of this discussion, because it seems to me that very often much of this debate is centered around attitudes towards migrant workers, low-wage migrant workers from particular countries, and the discrimination against them that frequently sort of accompanies that. And I think that many of the things that all three of you have sort of been discussing are rooted in these views of migrant workers, that they should be grateful that they're coming, that they're there's waves of them, that we see all these tropes and debates all the way around the world, and we see it within Asia as well as when migrants come to North America, when migrants come to Europe as well. And Bonny, for instance, we saw this big time in Taiwan during the COVID pandemic. Perhaps you could just sort of reiterate that story and the ways that this manifested itself there.
Yes. Thank you. So in Taiwan during the pandemic, Taiwan, for the first year of lockdowns abroad, Taiwan actually had a fairly normal existence. And then the lockdown came a bit later for Taiwan, a year later. And what happened was migrant workers at a factory, there was a cluster that emerged. And then so employers took the decision to put freedom of movement restrictions on the migrant workers. So it was basically to and from the dormitory to the workplace. And the reason was we needed to keep production going. Now, what they did had no basis in public health, right? It was not ordered by disease control, nor was it imposed for the general population. So we actually did a few programs then to try to, import lessons from Singapore on what not to do. And how can we manage the spread of disease in a way that's compliant with international human rights standards and make more public health sense. But we needed to do that because owing to the reasons that you said, we needed to be creative about these technical channels of these comparative, sharing lessons. And yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
And TT, this is what Myanmar workers experience everywhere. Constantly. Yep. It's low-waged, but a very low view of these workers, that they're viewed as others all the time. And that is why people feel that they can take advantage of them in these situations. Yeah.
Yes, and that, currently in the current situation, it's also more difficult to remedy, and also for these workers to actually have access to information, also have access to the grievance mechanisms, and even they might not have the information that they need or know their rights as well. So yes.
Yeah, and it's take it or leave it. You're lucky to get anything. Yeah, and Tamara, changing attitudes in the Gulf. What would you think? What would you hope?
I mean, I would hope attitude would start to change. I'm not sure I've seen much of that yet. But in the case of the Gulf, I think it's more, a lot of it is that there is a sense of kind of hierarchy amongst migrant workers. You know, one nationality is deemed to be sort of better than another, and there's obviously preference, there's usually preference for Muslim migrant workers, especially in domestic work. But I would hope to see some of this, obviously, change.
Great stuff. That brings us to the end. I think that was, you can see how just 3 different places, countries of origin and destination, can provide really complex situations that companies need to understand and then negotiate and make sure that when they're undertaking their due diligence, they've got this in full view so that they really have a good understanding of what's going on. So can we please thank the panel, please? Great.